Some legacies are buried deeper than others. In the Rust Belt hills of Pennsylvania, where abandoned factories stand like forgotten sentinels, a man in his 50s kneels in the snow beside an overturned car, his calloused hands working with practiced precision. The smell of gasoline hangs in the frigid air. Behind him looms the garage his grandfather built, the last piece of family history not yet swallowed by time and corporate hunger. He doesn't know that by morning, everything will change. He doesn't see the luxury car approaching through the blizzard, carrying a woman with secrets as heavy as his own. Doesn't realize that what lies beneath this struggling town has already been sold, bartered, and stolen through lies a century old. Some say you can't fight progress. Some say the future belongs to those willing to burn the past. But in places like this, where honor still means something, the most dangerous people are those with nothing left to lose except the truth their fathers died to protect. The howling January wind slashed across Frank Colton's face as he knelt beside the overturned SUV. 20 years since Afghanistan, but the muscle memory remained assess, decide, act. Inside the vehicle, a young family of 3 was trapped, the father unconscious, the mother struggling to reach her screaming toddler. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm," Frank shouted over the wind. "I'm going to get you out." The smell of gasoline hung in the air. Frank's weathered hands, still strong at 58, worked methodically with his bolt cutters, attacking the crushed driver's side door. Snow fell in thick, angry sheets, transforming the rural Pennsylvania road into a treacherous white void. "Please," the woman sobbed. "My husband's not breathing right." Frank spotted the spreading pool of liquid beneath the vehicle. "We don't have much time," he muttered, more to himself than to her. With one powerful thrust, he forced the door hinges to give way. The metallic groan as the door fell free was barely audible over the storm. The sharp tang of leaking fuel was stronger now. "Can you move? I need to get your husband out first." She nodded, dazed. Frank wedged himself into the crushed cabin, the cramped space reminding him of submarine rescue drills. He slipped his fingers to the man's neck, found a pulse weak but present. The dashboard had collapsed onto the man's legs, trapping him. "Sir, if you can hear me, this is going to hurt." Using his body as a lever, Frank pushed against the compressed dashboard. 30 years as a mechanic had given him an intimate understanding of how vehicles collapsed, and sometimes, how to make them uncollapse. The plastic and metal groaned in protest as he created just enough space. With practiced movements, Frank pulled the unconscious man free, dragging him through the snow to a safe distance. He returned immediately for the woman and child, urgency building as the smell of gasoline intensified. "Put your arms around my neck," he instructed, already reaching for the toddler's car seat. The woman complied wordlessly, her face tight with pain and fear. Frank carried them both, his knees protesting the weight. Behind them, the first flames appeared beneath the vehicle's hood. They had barely reached the unconscious man when the SUV erupted in a fireball that momentarily turned the snowy night into harsh daylight. The heat wave hit Frank's back as he sheltered the woman and child with his body. "My husband," she pleaded. "He's alive," Frank reassured her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Ambulance is on the way. Had to call before I came down here. Should be about—" The distant wail of sirens cut him off. "About now," Frank finished, allowing himself a small smile. The clock on the garage wall read 11:42 p.m. when Frank finally unlocked the door to Colton's auto service. The familiar smells of motor oil, metal, and his father's ancient coffee machine welcomed him home. This place had been his world for 30 years, ever since he'd returned from the Navy and taken over from his father. Now, like so many things in Bridgewood, it was barely hanging on. "Dad, you still up?" Frank called out, stamping snow from his boots. The small apartment above the garage had been their home since his divorce 3 years ago. His father's condition made institutional care impossible, at least that's what Frank told himself. The truth was, he couldn't bear to place Victor in a home, watching his father's memories dissolve day by day like sugar in hot coffee. "You're late, Robert," came the reply. Not Frank. Robert, his uncle, who died in Vietnam in 1968. Frank sighed, hanging up his coat. It's Frank, Dad, your son. Victor Colton sat in his old armchair, still handsome at 85, despite the confusion clouding his eyes. A photo album lay open on his lap, pages filled with fading snapshots of men in uniform, women in bright dresses, children playing in front yards long since replaced by parking lots. Frank, Victor repeated, momentarily lucid. There was an accident. How'd you know? Victor tapped his temple. Police scanner, still works. He pointed to the ancient device in the corner. One of his more coherent hobbies was monitoring emergency channels, a habit from his days as a volunteer firefighter. Frank nodded, too exhausted to question it. Family of 3. They'll make it. He moved to the kitchenette, opened the refrigerator, empty except for condiments and a few beers. He'd have to grocery shop tomorrow. Your hands are shaking, Victor observed. Frank looked down. His father was right. The adrenaline crash. Probably. Or maybe the weight of the day's earlier meeting with the bank. It's nothing. Dad, just the cold. Victor's eyes narrowed with surprising clarity. Bullshit. I taught you better than to lie to your old man. Frank couldn't help but smile. These moments of lucidity were becoming rarer. Precious glimpses of the tough, perceptive man who'd raised him alone after his mother died. Bank called in the loan, Frank admitted, dropping heavily onto the couch. Gave us 90 days. Those vultures, Victor spat. This garage built half this town. Your grandfather fixed their father's cars when they couldn't make payments. Different world now. Dad, no. Son, same world. Different people running it. Frank rubbed his eyes. The garage had been struggling for years. Electric vehicles needed less maintenance. The dealership service centers had manufacturer backing. And now Harrington Industries was buying up half the town for some green technology campus, driving property values beyond what local businesses could sustain. Maybe it's time, Frank said quietly. Michael thinks I should sell. Take the Harrington offer while it's still on the table. Victor snorted. Your son works for those corporate sharks. What does he know about community? He knows about paying for your medications, Frank replied, instantly regretting the sharpness in his tone. Sorry, Dad. It's been a long day. Victor waved away the apology, his gaze returning to the photo album. His fingers traced the outline of a young man in marine dress blues. Forever 22. Robert would have known what to do, he murmured. Always the smart one. Frank felt the familiar pang. Even with Alzheimer's eating away his memories, Victor never forgot his brother, never stopped wondering what might have been if Robert had come home. Get some sleep. Dad, I'll lock up. Downstairs, Frank surveyed the garage bay. 3 cars waited for morning Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick with transmission issues, Dave Miller's pickup needing a new catalytic converter, and a Prius with electrical problems that had already stolen 10 hours of diagnostic time. The filing cabinet in the corner held the latest notice from the bank, the rejected loan applications, and the increasingly insistent offers from Harrington Industries Development Division. Frank's gaze drifted to the wall of photographs, 3 generations of Colton men, standing proudly in front of the garage, the town growing and changing around them in each successive image. His cell phone buzzed. Michael? Hey, son, Frank answered, trying to keep the weariness from his voice. Dad, did you think about what we discussed? Michael's voice had the clipped, efficient tone he'd developed since moving to Boston and joining the corporate world. At 32, he was everything Frank wasn't college-educated, tech-savvy, forward-thinking. I'm thinking, Frank replied. Dad, the Harrington offer expires at the end of the month. This is a chance to pay off the loans, set up Grandpa's care, maybe even have something left to actually retire on. And what happens to Joe and Ellie? Frank asked, referring to his 2 employees, both with families depending on their paychecks. What happens to Mrs. Patterson, who can't afford dealer rates, or Dave Miller, who's keeping his 15-year-old truck running because it's all he's got? A sigh from the other end. Dad, you can't save everyone. Sometimes change is necessary. Your grandfather built this place with his bare hands, and you've carried it for 30 years. Nobody could say you didn't do your part, but Bridgewood is changing. This green technology campus could bring real jobs, revitalize the whole area. Frank stared at the wall of photos. I'll think about it, he repeated. That's all I'm asking. Michael's voice softened. Hey, I've got a meeting in Shanghai next month, but I was thinking of stopping by on the way back. Spend a couple days, see Grandpa. He'd like that, Frank said, a small spark of warmth cutting through his exhaustion. He had a good day today, mostly. After hanging up, Frank pulled out the bank notice again. 90 days to come up with $127,000, or the property would go to auction. The Harrington offer would cover it and then some. But accepting meant erasing 3 generations of family history. Outside, the storm had intensified, wind howling through the rafters of the old building. Frank moved to lower the garage's security shutters when headlights cut through the swirling snow. A car was approaching, expensive by the sound of the engine, struggling in the unplowed road. Frank hesitated. He was closed, exhausted, in no mood for emergency repairs. But 30 years of small-town business had ingrained certain values. You didn't leave people stranded in a Pennsylvania blizzard, no matter how tired you were. The vehicle stopped in front of the garage, its headlights illuminating the swirling snow like searchlights. Even through the storm, Frank could recognize the distinctive silhouette of a Bentley impossibly out of place in Bridgewood. Margaret Harrington, Maggie to the few who truly knew her, gripped the steering wheel of her Bentley as the engine made a sound no $200,000 vehicle should ever make. Steam billowed from under the hood, joining the swirling snow in the headlights' glare. Perfect, she muttered, pressing the emergency button on her dashboard. Nothing. The screen remained dark. She reached for her phone. No signal. Maggie closed her eyes, fighting the familiar tightness in her chest. Her cardiologist had warned against stress. Easy advice for someone who didn't run a multi-billion-dollar company while fighting off a hostile takeover from her ex-husband. At 52, Margaret Harrington had been featured in Fortune, Forbes, and Time, the face of next-generation sustainable technology. The Asian American woman disrupting the energy sector. What those glossy profiles never mentioned was the cost of failed marriage, a daughter who barely spoke to her, and a heart condition that gave her a 10% chance of seeing 60 without a transplant. Through the blizzard, she spotted a light, a service station of some kind, still open despite the late hour and brutal weather. The irony wasn't lost on her, the CEO of the country's largest green energy corporation, stranded and seeking help from what was undoubtedly a fossil fuel business. The sign came into view. Colton's Auto Service. Maggie frowned. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. Her exhaustion was catching up with her. She'd flown into Pittsburgh that morning, switched to the Bentley for the drive to Bridgewood. Tomorrow, technically today now, she was scheduled to finalize the purchase of the remaining properties needed for the technology campus. The cornerstone of her legacy, the project that would transform her company from merely successful to truly meaningful. If she survived long enough to see it built, another sharp pain lanced through her chest. Maggie reached into her purse, fingers closing around her medication. The bottle was empty. No, 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 she whispered, fighting the rising panic. Her emergency supply was in her suitcase, in the trunk. The Bentley made a final, definitive sound of mechanical distress and died completely. Maggie sat in sudden silence, the only sound her own too rapid breathing and the howl of the wind. She had to reach the garage. Gathering her coat around her, Maggie pushed open the car door, immediately assaulted by stinging, wind-driven snow. The cold stole her breath as she forced her way toward the light of the garage, each step an exercise in determination. 20 feet from safety, a different kind of light swept across her headlights, approaching too fast on the slick road. Maggie froze as a pickup truck fishtailed toward her, its driver fighting for control. A powerful force knocked her aside just as the truck slid past, missing her by inches. Maggie found herself in the snow, a large man shielding her with his body. "Are you crazy?" he shouted over the wind. Standing in the middle of the road in a whiteout, Maggie tried to respond, but the combination of cold, exertion, and rising panic had tightened her chest beyond her ability to speak. She clutched at her heart, gasping. The man's expression changed instantly from anger to concern. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She managed to form one word. "Medicine? Car?" Understanding dawned in his weathered face. Without hesitation, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, carrying her the remaining distance to the garage. The warmth inside was shocking after the bitter cold. "Where's your medication?" he asked, setting her gently on a chair. "Suitcase. Trunk," she managed between gasps. He nodded once, grabbed a heavy coat from a hook, and disappeared back into the storm. Maggie focused on controlling her breathing, using the techniques her cardiologist had taught her. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The pain wasn't subsiding. The man returned remarkably quickly, snow coating his shoulders, her suitcase in his hands. "Where in here?" "Side pocket," she wheezed. His fingers were surprisingly dexterous for their size. Quickly locating the prescription bottle, he read the label, filled a cup with water from a nearby cooler, and handed both to her. Maggie swallowed the medication, praying it would act quickly. The man watched her with concern, seemingly ready to call an ambulance or perform CPR at any moment. As the medication began to take effect, Maggie's breathing eased. She became more aware of her surroundings in an old-fashioned garage, meticulously organized, with the comforting smell of motor oil and the quiet ticking of a wall clock reading just past midnight. "Thank you," she said finally. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "No need," he replied simply. "I'm Frank Colton. This is my shop." "Margaret Harrington," she responded automatically, then immediately regretted giving her real name as recognition flickered in his eyes. "Harrington, as in Harrington Industries." She nodded reluctantly. Frank's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "What brings you to Bridgewood in the middle of a blizzard, Ms. Harrington?" The way he said her name made it clear he knew exactly who she was and exactly why she was in town. Before she could formulate a diplomatic response, a loud crash outside interrupted them. Frank moved to the window. "Damn it," he muttered. "Kellerman and his boys." Through the frosted glass, Maggie could make out 3 figures approaching her Bentley. Even from a distance, their intentions were obviously not benevolent. "Local trouble?" she asked. "Pete Kellerman lost his job when the mill closed. Now he and his friends help themselves to anything that looks valuable." Frank was already reaching for the phone. "I'll call Sheriff Davis, but in this weather, it'll be 20 minutes at least." Maggie stood, surprised at how steady she felt. "That's my car they're breaking into." "Ma'am, with all due respect, you just had what looked like a cardiac event. Let the sheriff handle this." She fixed him with the same stare that had quelled boardroom insurrections. "Mr. Colton, that vehicle contains confidential corporate documents. I can't wait 20 minutes. To her surprise, he actually smiled. "Tough lady, but those 3 out there aren't exactly reasonable businessmen. Then I suggest we be unreasonable back." Frank studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Wait here." He disappeared into a back room, returning with what looked like a shotgun. Seeing her expression, he added, "Rock salt loads. Won't kill anybody, but they'll sure remember it. You keep a shotgun loaded with rock salt for car thieves." "For deterrence," he corrected. "I haven't actually fired it in years. Usually just the sight of it sends them running." He handed her a heavy flashlight. "If it comes to it, this makes a decent club." Maggie took the flashlight, feeling its reassuring weight. "You do this often?" "Small town," Frank replied, as if that explained everything. Ready together, they stepped back into the storm. The three men were now attempting to force open the Bentley's trunk, their pickup idling nearby with the headlights illuminating the scene. "That's far enough. Pete," Frank called out, his voice carrying authority despite the howling wind. The men turned. The largest, presumably, Pete straightened up, a crowbar in his hand. "Well, if it isn't Frank Colton, town hero," he sneered. "This ain't your business. Old man." "It's my property you're trespassing on," Frank replied evenly. "And that's my customer's car you're trying to break into." Pete's laugh was ugly. "Customer? Huh. Since when do people around here drive Bentleys?" His gaze shifted to Maggie, and something in his expression changed. "Well, well, what have we here?" "The owner of that vehicle," Maggie replied coldly. "And I suggest you walk away now." "Oh, I know exactly who you are." Pete took a step forward. "You're the corporate vulture buying up the town. Aren't you, Harrington?" "Right. Come to survey your kingdom." Frank moved slightly, positioning himself between Maggie and the advancing man. "Pete, you're drunk. Go home before this gets worse." "Worse?" Pete's voice rose. "How could it get worse? My house is in foreclosure. My kid can't afford college. And this rich bitch comes to town to build her fancy tech campus that none of us will ever work in." "That's not true," Maggie interjected. "The campus will create hundreds of jobs. For who? College kids from Pittsburgh, engineers from California." Pete spat in the snow. "Not for welders and machinists. The construction alone will employ local, temporary jobs." Pete was shouting now. "Then what? Back to nothing while you get richer?" Frank's stance shifted almost imperceptibly. Maggie recognized the change. This was a man preparing for a fight, assessing threats, calculating moves. She'd seen the same subtle transformation in her security team when situations deteriorated. "Last chance, Pete," Frank warned. "Sheriff's on his way." The other two men glanced nervously at each other, but Pete was too far gone in rage and alcohol. "You're defending her," he demanded of Frank. "After what her company's doing to you, to your father's garage." Frank's expression revealed nothing. "This isn't the way, Pete." Pete raised the crowbar. "Maybe it's exactly the way." What happened next occurred so quickly that Maggie barely registered the sequence. Pete lunged forward. Frank moved with surprising speed, the shotgun coming up not to fire but to block the crowbar's arc. In the same fluid motion, his boot connected with Pete's knee, dropping the larger man to the ground with a howl of pain. The other two men rushed forward. Frank tossed the shotgun aside, unwilling to risk it discharging in the scuffle, and met them with practiced efficiency. A sharp elbow to one's solar plexus, a sweeping leg taking the other's feet from under him. Maggie wasn't idle. As the smaller of the two men scrambled back to his feet, she swung the heavy flashlight in a perfect arc that connected with his shoulder. He yelped in pain and stumbled backward. In less than a minute, it was over. Pete remained on the ground, clutching his knee, the other two retreating toward their pickup. "This ain't over, Colton," Pete snarled as his friends helped him to the truck. Frank watched them drive away, then turned to Maggie, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You swing pretty good for a CEO." "Tennis 3 times a week," she replied, surprised to find herself almost smiling. "Plus self-defense training after a shareholder got too aggressive at an annual meeting." Frank nodded approvingly, then gestured to the Bentley. "Let's get your things inside. That car's not going anywhere tonight, and neither are you with this storm." As they collected her luggage and the crucial briefcase of documents, Maggie felt another pain in her chest, milder this time, but a reminder of her condition. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she'd like to admit. Inside the garage, Frank seemed to notice her discomfort. "There's an apartment upstairs. My father and I live there, but the couch is comfortable enough. Better than trying to find a hotel in this weather." Maggie hesitated. Staying in a strange man's apartment wasn't exactly protocol for a Fortune 500 CEO. On the other hand, neither was almost having a heart attack in a blizzard or fighting off car thieves with a flashlight. "Thank you," she said finally. I appreciate your hospitality, Mr. Colton. Frank, he corrected, gathering her bags. And don't thank me yet. My father has Alzheimer's. Some nights are better than others. As they climbed the stairs to the apartment, Maggie realized why the name Colton had sounded familiar. Her acquisition team had highlighted this property as one of the final holdouts, a strategically located garage whose owner had repeatedly rejected their offers. She was spending the night with the enemy. The irony was almost as painful as her heart condition. Frank's father was asleep when they entered the apartment, for which he was grateful. Victor's unpredictable behavior could be challenging for strangers to navigate, and Frank wasn't in the mood to explain why he'd brought home the very woman trying to demolish their livelihood. Coffee, he offered, keeping his voice low. Margaret Harrington Maggie, as she'd asked him to call her during their walk from the car, nodded gratefully. She looked out of place in the modest apartment with her designer clothes and perfect posture, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she'd seen harder times than her current status implied. Navy, she asked, gesturing to a photograph on the wall of a much younger Frank in uniform. 10 years, submarine service. Mechanic. Of course. Of course, she echoed, accepting the mug he handed her. Your father was military too. Frank nodded. Marines, Vietnam. His brother died there in '68. A simple statement of fact, but Maggie seemed to hear the weight behind it. I'm sorry. Long time ago. Frank settled into his chair, suddenly aware of how tired he was. The adrenaline from the roadside rescue, the confrontation with Pete, and now the surreal situation of hosting the CEO of Harrington Industries in his living room, it was catching up to him. You know why I'm in town, Maggie said after a moment. Not a question, but a statement. To finish buying up what's left of Bridgewood, she winced slightly at his bluntness. I prefer to think of it as revitalizing a struggling community. Fancy words for the same result. Local businesses gone, families displaced. Progress often requires difficult transitions, she replied, her tone shifting into what Frank imagined was her professional voice. But the Bridgewood Technology Campus will create sustainable jobs, educational opportunities. For who? Frank interrupted, echoing Pete's earlier question, but without the rage. The people who've lived and worked here for generations are welders, machinists, factory workers. What place do they have in your green future? Maggie set down her coffee mug. That's exactly why we're implementing a comprehensive retraining program. 6 months of paid education for any resident who wants to transition into new technology sectors. 6 months to learn an entirely new profession, after working 20, 30 years in another field. Frank shook his head. Have you ever actually met the people whose lives you're transitioning? I grew up in Detroit, Mr. Colton. My father lost his job when the auto plant closed. I understand economic disruption intimately. That surprised him. Nothing in the magazine profiles he'd seen had mentioned a blue-collar background. Then you should understand why people here are resistant. I do. Her expression softened slightly. But resistance to change won't bring the steel mills back. It won't make combustion engines relevant again. The world is moving forward, with or without Bridgewood. So we either get on board or get left behind. Those are the only options. Those are the economic realities. Frank studied her for a moment. Despite her corporate polish, there was something genuine in her conviction. She truly believed in what she was doing. Why Bridgewood? He asked finally. There are dying industrial towns all over Pennsylvania. Why us? A flicker of something caution crossed her face. Geography, infrastructure, tax incentives. It was a data-driven decision. He didn't believe her. Not entirely, but before he could press further, a noise from his father's room interrupted them. Robert, is that you? Victor's voice, confused and hopeful. Frank rose immediately. Excuse me. In the small bedroom, Victor was sitting up, eyes bright with an excitement that Frank knew would soon turn to disappointment. Dad, it's Frank. Your son. Victor shook his head impatiently. I know that. I meant your guest. Is it Robert? Frank felt a familiar sadness. No, Dad. Uncle Robert died in Vietnam. Remember, our guest is a woman whose car broke down? Victor's face fell, reality reasserting itself painfully. Of course. I'm sorry, son. He rubbed his eyes. I had a dream. So real. Robert was trying to tell me something important. About the land. What about the land? Dad. But Victor's moment of clarity was already fading. Who's here? He asked, changing subjects with the abruptness characteristic of his condition. A stranded motorist. Her car broke down in the storm. Victor nodded, the information processing slowly. You always were a good boy. Frank, helping people. Like your grandfather taught us. He settled back against his pillows. I'm tired now. Get some rest. Dad. Frank adjusted the blankets. A gesture from childhood reversed. When he returned to the living room, Maggie was examining the wall of family photographs with evident interest. Is he okay? She asked. Good moments and bad. That was somewhere in between. Frank reclaimed his seat. You were about to tell me the real reason you chose Bridgewood for your project. Maggie hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Your town sits on one of the largest untapped deposits of rare earth elements in North America. Frank stared at her. What? Neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, critical components for everything from wind turbines to electric vehicles? She met his gaze directly. Elements that China currently controls 90% of the global supply of, and that are essential for green technology. You're saying there's a mine under Bridgewood? Not yet, but yes, that's the long-term plan. The technology campus is phase 1. The extraction facility would be phase 2, employing many of the same skill sets your community already has from its mining and steel production history. Frank processed this information slowly. Does the town council know about phase 2? They know we're conducting geological surveys. The full scope is still confidential market sensitivity, competitive concerns. You mean you haven't told the people you're buying property from that you're planning to mine under their feet? Maggie's expression hardened slightly. We're offering well above market value for those properties. Because you know what's underneath them. Because we're investing in the future of this region. The standoff was interrupted by a soft chime from Maggie's phone. She checked it, frowning. I need to take this. Excuse me. She moved to the far corner of the living room, speaking in low tones. Frank couldn't hear the details, but her body language suggested the call wasn't bringing good news. When she returned, her professional mask had slipped, revealing genuine concern. My head of security, she explained. There's been a situation at the hotel where my team is staying. Someone gained access to our rooms, went through our documents. Pete and his friends, she shook her head. This wasn't smash and grab. It was targeted, professional. They knew exactly what they were looking for, which was, Maggie hesitated again, geological surveys, land assessments, specifically, everything relating to what I just told you about. Frank considered this. You're not the only ones who know about these rare earth deposits. Are you? No. We've had indications that a consortium of foreign investors has been taking an interest in the region. Russian money, primarily through a series of shell companies. She rubbed her temples. I need to contact my team, let them know I'm safe, coordinate our response. Phone lines are down, Frank informed her. Cell service too, probably. The landline might work for local calls, but nothing long distance when a storm hits this hard. Maggie looked genuinely distressed for the first time since he'd met her. I have to reach them. There are sensitive documents in my car, the backup data on a secure drive. In the trunk where Pete was trying to break in. Yes, Frank stood up. I'll check your car. Make sure everything's secure. You should rest. You've had a rough night, and that heart condition isn't something to take lightly. Her eyes widened slightly. How did you? I saw the medication label. Ran a medical unit in the Navy for a while. I recognize heart meds when I see them. He pulled on his coat. "The storm's supposed to break by morning. We'll figure things out then." As he headed for the door, Maggie called after him. "Why are you helping me? I represent everything that's threatening your way of life." Frank paused, considering the question. "My grandfather had a saying, judge the crisis, not the person in it. Right now, you're just someone who needs help." Outside, the storm had begun to abate, the wind less ferocious, the snowfall lighter. Frank made his way to the Bentley, checking that it was secure. No signs that Pete had managed to break in before their confrontation. As he turned to head back inside, a movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness beside a neighboring building. Frank tensed, preparing for another confrontation with Pete and his friends. But the figure that emerged was no local troublemaker. The man wore a heavy parka with a fur-lined hood, his movements precise and deliberate as he approached the Bentley. When he spotted Frank, he froze momentarily, then reached into his coat. Frank didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. He charged forward, closing the distance before the man could fully withdraw what Frank was certain would be a weapon. His shoulder connected with the stranger's midsection, driving him backward into a snowbank. The man recovered quickly, rolling away and coming up in a fighting stance that spoke of professional training. In the dim light from the garage, Frank could see Slavic features, cold eyes assessing him with lethal calculation. "You do not want this fight, old man," the stranger said, his accent confirming Frank's suspicions. "Yet here we are," Frank replied, centering his weight, recalling close-quarters combat training from decades ago. The man struck first, a rapid series of blows that Frank mostly blocked or deflected, though one caught him painfully in the ribs. Frank countered with a solid punch to the man's kidney, followed by an elbow strike that connected with his jaw. They grappled in the snow, each seeking advantage. The stranger was younger, professionally trained, but Frank had the weight of experience and the home field advantage of knowing every ice patch and obstruction in his own lot. The fight ended abruptly when Frank maneuvered his opponent near the garage's side entrance, then triggered the motion-activated floodlights with a well-aimed snowball. Temporarily blinded, the man hesitated just long enough for Frank to land a decisive blow to his solar plexus, followed by a sweeping leg takedown that slammed him hard onto the icy pavement. Frank pinned him, one knee pressing into the man's chest. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man glared up at him, blood trickling from his split lip. "You have no idea what you're involved in. American, try me." A vehicle's headlights swept across them as a black SUV turned into the lot. The man beneath Frank smiled coldly. "My associates have arrived. You should run now, while you can." Frank increased the pressure on the man's chest. "Not my style." The SUV stopped, its doors opened, and two more men emerged, both with the same professional bearing as the first. One reached inside his coat, and this time Frank had no doubt about what was coming out. A gunshot cracked through the night air. For a bizarre moment, Frank thought he'd been hit, felt phantom pain blooming in his chest. Then he realized the shot had come from behind him. "Next one won't miss," Maggie's voice rang out, startlingly authoritative. She stood in the garage doorway, Frank's shotgun in her hands, aimed steadily at the new arrivals. "I may be a CEO, but I grew up in Detroit. I know how to use this." The men by the SUV assessed the situation with cold calculation. After a tense moment, the one who'd reached for his weapon slowly raised his hands. "This is not finished," he said, his accent matching his colleagues. "It is for tonight," Maggie replied. "Leave." The man Frank had fought struggled beneath him. "You're making a mistake. Both of you. What's under this town is worth billions. The woman knows this. Ask her who will really benefit from her company's project." Frank increased the pressure one last time. "Get out of my town." He released the man, stepping back but remaining ready. The stranger rose, brushing snow from his clothes with deliberate calmness, then joined his associates. The SUV departed as quietly as it had arrived, leaving Frank and Maggie alone in the suddenly silent night. "Those weren't Pete's friends," Frank observed unnecessarily. "No," Maggie agreed, lowering the shotgun. Russian private security, if I had to guess. Probably working for the consortium I mentioned. Frank studied her with new eyes. The woman who had so confidently held armed men at bay seemed very different from the corporate executive he'd initially judged her to be. You said you grew up in Detroit, a small, tight smile, 8 Mile Road, before the Renaissance? Frank nodded slowly. Let's get inside. I think we both have more explaining to do. As they returned to the apartment, Frank noticed Maggie press a hand to her chest. Her breathing labored from the exertion and stress. Her medication might control her symptoms, but it was clear her heart condition was serious, perhaps more serious than she wanted to admit. You should rest, he said, softening his tone. Whatever's going on can wait until morning. For once, she didn't argue. Thank you, Frank, for everything tonight. Don't thank me yet, he replied, echoing his earlier warning. I have a feeling things are about to get a lot more complicated. He had no idea how right he was. Morning arrived with harsh clarity, sunlight reflecting off pristine snow that buried Bridgewood under nearly 2 feet of accumulation. Frank had slept poorly, his mind cycling through the night's events, trying to reconcile the woman sleeping on his couch with the corporate entity threatening his livelihood. He found Maggie already awake, standing at the apartment's small window, gazing out at the transformed landscape. She'd changed into simpler clothes, jeans, and a sweater that probably cost more than Frank's best suit, but still a notable departure from her previous corporate armor. Power's out in most of town, he informed her, moving to the kitchenette. The old building had a generator, another of his father's practical preparations. But we've got enough to run the essentials. Coffee, please. She turned from the window. Your father, still sleeping. His medication helps him rest through the night, but it means he's usually down until about 9. Shunam, Maggie nodded, accepting the mug he offered. I've been thinking about our visitors last night. If they went after my team at the hotel, they might have accessed sensitive information about our project and about the real reason we're interested in Bridgewood. The rare earth elements? Yes, which means they might also know which properties are most valuable for extraction. Frank considered this as he sipped his coffee. Including mine. Especially yours. The geological surveys indicate that the richest concentration is directly beneath this part of town. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. After generations of the Colton family working this land, it turned out the real value had been underfoot the entire time. So these Russians, they want to buy the land themselves. Cut out Harrington Industries. Maggie shook her head. It's more complicated than that. My company has the mining rights, secured through the state years ago when we first discovered the deposits. What they want is to force us out, then buy the rights at distressed prices? And how exactly would they force out a multi-billion-dollar corporation? She met his gaze directly. By sabotaging our project, creating community resistance, making the political costs too high for us to proceed? Like stirring up guys like Pete Kellerman, Frank suggested, playing on existing resentments. Exactly. Plus corporate espionage, targeted misinformation campaigns, environmental protests based on fake data. Maggie set down her mug. You think I'm being paranoid? I think global mineral rights are a bit above my pay grade, Frank admitted. But I know what I saw last night, and those weren't concerned local citizens. Before Maggie could respond, Frank's phone buzzed. The display showed Sheriff Davis calling. Frank, you seeing this? The sheriff's voice was tense when he answered. Seeing what? Ray, turn on your TV. Channel 7. Frank moved to the small television in the corner, Maggie following curiously. The local news was showing footage of a protest outside the Bridgewood Town Hall, dozens of people with signs opposing the Harrington project, some specifically mentioning environmental concerns about secret mining operations. When was this filmed? Frank asked the sheriff. That's just it. It's happening right now. These people showed up at dawn, half of them strangers nobody's ever seen before. Professional agitators would be my guess. Frank glanced at Maggie, who was watching the broadcast with growing alarm. Any sign of Pete Kellerman or his buddies? Frank asked. Front and center. the sheriff confirmed. Looking surprisingly well organized for a guy who's usually face down at O'Malley's by noon. Listen, Frank, there's something else. Someone leaked documents online, geological surveys, mining plans, the works. People are saying Harrington Industries is planning to strip mine the whole town. That's completely false, Maggie interjected, loud enough for the sheriff to hear. Who's that with you? Ray asked. Frank hesitated, then decided on transparency. Margaret Harrington. Her car broke down in the storm last night. A long whistle from the other end. Well, Ms. Harrington, you might want to stay put for now. The mood in town isn't exactly welcoming toward your company at the moment. Sheriff, those leaked documents have been altered, Maggie insisted. The actual extraction plan involves deep mining techniques with minimal surface disruption. Someone is deliberately spreading misinformation. Ma'am, all due respect, but trying to explain technical mining details to people who just found out there's a plan to dig under their homes isn't going to go over well right now. The sheriff's voice was strained. Frank, I'm stretched thin here. If things escalate, I may need to call in state support. Understood. Keep me posted. Kaverdora Frank ended the call, turning to Maggie. Your Russian friends work fast. This is exactly their playbook, she agreed grimly. Create public outrage, force us to abandon the project, then swoop in as saviors with their own environmentally friendly proposal, which will actually involve much more destructive extraction methods once they have control. Frank processed this information, his mind working through the implications. You need to get in front of this. Make a public statement. Release the real documents. I need to reach my team first. The secure drive in my car has the original surveys, environmental impact studies, everything we'd need to counter these false claims. Frank nodded decisively. I'll check your car. Get the drive. You try the landline. See if you can reach anyone at your company. As he headed for the door, Maggie caught his arm. Why are you helping me last night? You were ready to defend your garage against everything I represent. Frank considered the question. Because right now, the threat to this town isn't your project. It's whoever's trying to manipulate us all into fighting each other instead of seeing the bigger picture. He paused. Also, I don't like being played, especially not by outsiders with hidden agendas. She smiled slightly. A pragmatist. Just a mechanic who's seen enough broken things to know the difference between normal wear and deliberate sabotage. Outside, the morning sun had begun melting the top layer of snow, creating a deceptive sheen over the treacherous ice beneath. Frank made his way carefully to the Bentley, noting with concern that someone had cleared the snow around it recently, based on the fresh tracks. The driver's side window had been smashed, glass fragments glittering on the pristine snow. Frank approached cautiously, scanning the surroundings for any sign of the Russians from the previous night. Nothing moved in the still morning, except steam rising from plowed sections of the main road. The car's interior had been thoroughly searched, the glove compartment hanging open, the center console ransacked. Frank checked the trunk, already knowing what he would find. Empty. The secure drive was gone. A noise behind him made Frank spin around, adrenaline spiking. But it was only Michael, his son, trudging through the snow toward him. Dad, what happened? Michael gestured to the damaged Bentley. And since when do Bridgewood residents drive cars like this? Frank stared at his son in confusion. Michael, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Boston. I was worried after the storm hit. Tried calling, couldn't get through. Michael surveyed the damaged vehicle with professional interest. Seriously, though, whose car is this? Before Frank could answer, the garage door opened, and Maggie emerged, immediately drawing Michael's attention. Ms. Harrington. Michael's shocked expression would have been comical under different circumstances. Michael. Maggie looked equally surprised. What are you doing here? Frank looked between them, comprehension dawning with sickening clarity. You two know each other. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Ms. Harrington is, Harrington Industries is a client of my firm. I've been consulting on their renewable energy division's expansion. Including the Bridgewood project, Frank asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Dad, I can explain. You knew, Frank interrupted. You knew what they were planning here, what it would mean for the garage, for the town, and you still pushed me to sell? It's a good deal. Dad, above market value, fair terms. Fair Frank's anger finally broke through. You've been working for the people trying to demolish everything our family built, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning? Michael's expression hardened. I've been trying to help you see reality. This town is dying. The garage is dying. I'm offering you a way out with dignity and financial security. I didn't raise you to cash in your principles for a consulting fee. No, you raised me to work on obsolete technology until it drags me down with it. Michael's voice rose to match his father's. The world is changing. Dad, electric vehicles, autonomous systems, the future doesn't need mechanics like you. The words hung in the frigid air between them. Maggie stood awkwardly to the side, witnessing the family rupture she had inadvertently catalyzed. Frank took a deep breath, steadying himself. The secure drive is gone, he told Maggie, his voice controlled. Someone got to it before us. She nodded grimly. I was afraid of that. The landline's dead too. What secure drive? Michael asked, looking between them. What's going on? Your client can explain, Frank replied coldly. I need to check on Dad. As he turned toward the garage, Victor Colton appeared in the doorway, fully dressed in his old Marine Corps jacket despite the cold, his eyes clearer than they had been in weeks. Frank, he called out, his voice stronger than usual. I remembered what Robert was trying to tell me. About the land. Frank stopped, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature running through him. What about the land? Dad. Victor stepped carefully onto the snowy pavement, his gaze moving from Frank to Michael, then settling on Maggie with unexpected recognition. You're Howard Harrington's daughter, he said, astonishing all of them. You look just like him. Maggie stared at the old man. You knew my father. Vietnam, 1968. Your father was a combat photographer. He was with Robert's unit when Victor faltered, decades-old pain flickering across his face. When my brother died, Dad, are you sure? Frank asked gently. Victor's moments of clarity often included confabulations, memories that seemed real, but were products of his disease. Show me your arms, Victor demanded of Maggie, ignoring Frank's question. Bewildered, Maggie pushed up her sleeves, revealing a distinctive birthmark on her right forearm, a small, dark patch shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. Victor nodded in satisfaction. Howard had the same mark. He showed it to me when we met after Robert died. Said it ran in his family. He turned to Frank. This is the woman Robert was trying to warn me about in my dream. Dad, not like that, Victor corrected impatiently. He was trying to remind me about the papers, the ones in my toolbox. What papers? Frank asked, increasingly concerned about his father's state of mind. Instead of answering, Victor turned and walked purposefully back into the garage. After exchanging puzzled glances, the others followed. Inside, Victor moved directly to an old, battered toolbox in the corner, a relic that had belonged to Frank's grandfather. Untouched for years, with surprising dexterity, he worked the rusted latch and lifted the lid. Your grandfather wasn't just a mechanic, Victor explained as he rummaged through the ancient tools. He was also the keeper of the records for the original land trust. Land trust, Michael echoed. What land trust? Victor withdrew a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. The Bridgewood Seneca Covenant of 1873, the original agreement between the town founders and the Seneca Nation. He handed the envelope to Frank with ceremonial solemnity. The land you're all fighting over doesn't belong to any of you. It belongs to the descendants of the Seneca people who signed this covenant. Frank stared at the envelope in his hands, then at his father's suddenly lucid face. Dad, are you saying the town doesn't legally own the land it's built on? Not the land underneath, Victor confirmed. The surface rights were granted for settlement, but the mineral rights were explicitly reserved for the Seneca Nation in perpetuity. He turned to Maggie. Your father knew this. He was helping Robert document it before he died. Maggie looked stunned. That's impossible. Our legal team cleared all the titles, secured mining rights through the state. Based on fraudulent documents, Victor interrupted. In 1924, the county recorder destroyed the original covenant and replaced it with a falsified version that transferred all rights to the town. But your father and Robert made copies of the original before that happened. He tapped the envelope in Frank's hands. This is one of those copies. The implications were staggering. If Victor was right, if his memory could be trusted, then neither Harrington Industries nor the Russian consortium had any legitimate claim to the minerals beneath Bridgewood. Why didn't you tell me about this before? Frank asked his father. Victor's expression clouded slightly, the first sign that his remarkable clarity might be fading. I forgot. For a long time, I forgot almost everything. He rubbed his temple. But Robert kept reminding me in my dreams, especially after they started drilling test wells on the old Miller property. Michael, who had been watching this exchange with growing disbelief, stepped forward. This can't be right. The legal documentation for the Harrington project is airtight. I've seen it myself. Have you seen this? Frank challenged, holding up the envelope. Before Michael could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. Through the garage windows, they could see several black SUVs pulling into the lot, followed by a police cruiser with Sheriff Davis at the wheel. Looks like we've got company, Frank observed grimly, and I don't think they're here to offer fair market value for the garage. He turned to his father, who was watching the approaching vehicles with the calm assessment of a man who had seen far worse threats in his lifetime. Dad, is there a back way out of here? Victor nodded. The old service tunnel connects to the storm drainage system. Your grandfather used it during Prohibition to run a side business. He smiled faintly. Some family secrets are worth keeping. Frank made a quick decision. Michael, you stay here. Talk to the sheriff. Tell him we've gone to get supplies or check on a neighbor, anything to buy us time. Dad, you can't seriously be planning to, for once in your life, son, trust that I know what I'm doing. Frank's voice left no room for argument. He turned to Maggie. I assume you're coming with us. She glanced out the window at the approaching vehicles, then back at the envelope in Frank's hands. Absolutely. Good, Dad. Show us this tunnel. We need to move. As Victor led them toward the back of the garage, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled into something much bigger than a corporate land grab or a family disagreement about the future of a small-town auto shop. They were about to uncover a truth that had been buried for nearly a century, a truth that could change not just the fate of Bridgewood, but the very foundation of who owned the increasingly valuable earth beneath their feet. And based on the determined expressions of the men emerging from those black SUVs, some people would go to extreme lengths to ensure that truth remained buried. The service tunnel was exactly as Victor had described it: narrow, damp, and smelling of decades-old bootleg whiskey. Frank led the way, flashlight in hand, his father's remarkably clear directions guiding them through the forgotten underground passage. Your grandfather built this, Maggie asked, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Built is generous, Frank replied. More like connected existing storm drains and cellars. Prohibition made entrepreneurs of a lot of people, including Colton's. Apparently, family legend says he only ran whiskey to fund the garage during the Depression. Frank ducked beneath a low-hanging pipe. Dad always claimed we were reluctant outlaws. Behind them, Victor moved with surprising agility for a man of his age, especially one with Alzheimer's. The emergency seemed to have activated some deeply embedded part of his military training, his movements precise and his focus unwavering. How much farther? Maggie asked, pressing a hand to her chest in a gesture Frank had come to recognize as a sign of her managing pain. Exit's about 50 yards ahead, Victor answered before Frank could. Opens up behind the old Mason Lodge. Frank glanced back at his father, concerned by this unusual clarity. He'd seen it before in Alzheimer's patients during his Navy medical training, a phenomenon doctors called terminal lucidity, where patients experienced a temporary but dramatic improvement before a significant decline. The thought that this might be Victor's last rally sent a spike of fear through Frank's chest. "Dad, how are you feeling?" he asked carefully. Victor smiled slightly. "Clearer than I have in years. Don't worry, son. I know what you're thinking, but I've got a bit more time left." The tunnel ended at a rusted metal door that protested loudly as Frank forced it open. They emerged behind a dilapidated building on the outskirts of town, a half-mile from the garage. "We need transportation," Frank said, scanning the area. "And we need to contact someone about that covenant." "My legal team," Maggie suggested. "If what your father says is true, they need to know immediately. Your legal team works for a company that's been trying to mine land they don't have rights to," Frank pointed out. "You sure they're the right people for this?" Maggie's expression hardened. "I built Harrington Industries on ethical principles. Mr. Colton, if we've been proceeding on fraudulent documentation, I want to know about it even more than you do." Frank studied her face, searching for deception and finding none. "All right, but we need a neutral third party too. Someone with no stake in this." "I know who," Victor interjected. "Sarah Whitefeather, Robert's fiancée before he died. She's a tribal rights attorney now. Works out of Pittsburgh." Frank and Maggie both stared at him. "Dad, you never mentioned Robert was engaged." Victor's eyes clouded momentarily. "Didn't I? She was Seneca. That's why he was helping document the covenant. For her family." He shook his head as if clearing cobwebs. "After he died, she went to law school, specialized in Native American land claims. We kept in touch until I started forgetting things." "Do you know how to contact her?" Maggie asked gently. "Last I heard, she worked with the Native American Rights Fund, had an office in Pittsburgh." Victor frowned, concentrating. "Her number, I had it written down somewhere." "In your address book," Frank recalled. "The one in your nightstand." "Yes, that's right," Frank calculated quickly. "The address book is back at the garage, which is currently surrounded by people we'd rather avoid. We need to find another way to reach her." "I might be able to help," Maggie offered. "My assistant keeps thorough contact information for tribal representatives involved in land use consultations. If Ms. Whitefeather is still active in that field, she might be in our database." "And how do we access this database without your secure phone or laptop?" Frank asked. Maggie reached into her pocket and produced a small flip phone, the kind Frank hadn't seen in years. "Burner phone. I keep one for emergencies." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Standard CEO practice." "Detroit habits die hard," she replied with the ghost of a smile. "Trust issues have kept me alive this long." She dialed a number from memory, turning slightly away as she spoke in low, urgent tones to someone she clearly trusted implicitly. Frank used the moment to check on his father, who had begun to look tired, the extraordinary clarity in his eyes dimming slightly. "How's the heart?" Frank asked Maggie when she ended her call. She gave him a sharp look. "Functional. My assistant is searching for Sarah Whitefeather's contact information. She'll call back on this phone in 10 minutes. "Good. In the meantime, we need to find somewhere safe to examine that covenant." Victor, who had been silently scanning their surroundings, spoke up. "Miller's Hardware. Joe Miller's grandson still runs it. He was a friend of Robert's, too." The hardware store was 4 blocks away, a local institution that had somehow survived the economic downturn through sheer stubbornness and diversification. Frank had known Dave Miller his entire life. They'd played high school football together, gone their separate ways for a while, then reconnected when Frank returned to Bridgewood after his Navy service. "Dave's solid," Frank agreed. "And the store has a basement office where we can look at these documents without being seen." They moved cautiously through back alleys and side streets, avoiding the main roads where Sheriff Davis and his unwelcome companions might be searching. As they walked, Frank found himself acutely aware of Maggie struggling to keep pace, her breathing becoming increasingly labored despite her efforts to hide it. "We need to rest," he announced when they were halfway to their destination. "I'm fine," Maggie insisted, though her complexion suggested otherwise. "Your medication," Frank pressed. "Do you have it with you?" She nodded reluctantly, withdrawing the pill bottle from her pocket. Frank watched as she took a tablet, concerned by the tremor in her hands. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly while Victor scouted ahead. "Your heart condition?" Maggie met his gaze, and for the first time since they'd met, she allowed the corporate mask to drop completely. "Without a transplant, 18 months, maybe less." The blunt honesty caught Frank off guard. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've lived an interesting life." She gestured toward their current predicament. "Evidently, it's still interesting. Any prospects for a transplant? I'm on the list, but there are complications, antibody issues, tissue compatibility." She shrugged with forced casualness. "The campus project was supposed to be my legacy, in case the transplant doesn't happen in time." Frank processed this information, reevaluating everything he thought he knew about Margaret Harrington's motivations. "So this isn't just about profit for you?" "It never was," she replied simply. "The rare earth elements are crucial for green technology development. American sources would reduce dependence on foreign supplies, create domestic jobs, and help transition communities like Bridgewood into the new economy." She paused. "At least, that was the plan. And now we need to understand what this covenant actually says. If the mineral rights truly belong to the Seneca Nation, that changes everything." Victor rejoined them, signaling that the path ahead was clear. They continued toward Miller's Hardware, each lost in their own thoughts about what the century-old document might reveal. The store was open when they arrived, a bell chiming cheerfully as they entered through the back door. Dave Miller looked up from behind the counter, his expression shifting from welcome to confusion to concern as he recognized the unlikely trio. "Frank Victor." His gaze settled on Maggie. "And Ms. Harrington. We need a private place to talk." "Dave," Frank said without preamble. "It's important." Dave Miller was not a man who asked unnecessary questions in a crisis. He simply nodded, flipped the open sign to closed, and led them to the basement office. "Whatever you need," he told Frank. "Just like old times." "Huh?" Frank clasped his friend's shoulder gratefully. "Hopefully with less property damage than high school." Once they were safely settled in the cluttered but comfortable basement office, Frank carefully opened the oilcloth package. The wax seal cracked after nearly a century of preservation, revealing pages of faded but still legible handwritten text. "The Bridgewood Seneca Covenant," Frank read aloud, "entered into this 15th day of May, 1873 between the representatives of the Bridgewood settlement and the appointed elders of the Seneca Nation." The document was detailed and specific, outlining the terms under which the Seneca had agreed to allow settlement on their ancestral lands. The language was formal and legalistic, with clauses carefully delineating surface rights versus mineral and water rights. "Here it is," Frank said, pointing to a key passage. "All minerals, ores, and valuable substances existing below the depth of 10 feet from the surface shall remain the exclusive property of the Seneca Nation and their descendants in perpetuity." "There's more," Maggie noted, reading further. "Any extraction of said materials shall require explicit consent of the Seneca Council and fair compensation as determined by mutually agreed assessors." Victor nodded in satisfaction. "Robert died trying to protect this document. The county recorder who falsified the records in 1924 was working for mining interests. When Robert and your father discovered the fraud, they became targets." "My father?" Maggie looked up sharply. "What happened to him?" "He survived," Victor reassured her. "But he was threatened, forced to leave the area. That's why he never spoke of it, I imagine." The burner phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Maggie answered, listened briefly, then wrote something on a notepad. "We have contact information for Sarah Whitefeather," she announced after hanging up. "She's still practicing law in Pittsburgh, specializing in indigenous rights cases." Frank took the notepad, studying the phone number and address. "We need to get this covenant to her immediately. If these Russian investors are willing to break into hotel rooms and cars, they won't hesitate to destroy this document if they find it." "I'll call her," Maggie offered, reaching for the phone. "Wait," Frank cautioned. "We should go in person. Phone calls can be intercepted, especially now that they know we're onto them." "Pittsburgh is 2 hours away," Maggie pointed out, "and we don't have a vehicle." Frank turned to Dave Miller, who had been listening with increasing concern. "Dave, we need to borrow your truck." "Take it," Dave replied without hesitation. "But Frank, there are people looking for you." Sheriff Davis came by earlier, asking questions, and he wasn't alone. Had some serious-looking guys in suits with him. "Russians?" Frank asked. Dave shook his head. "American? Corporate types. One of them mentioned Harrington Industries." Maggie's expression darkened. "Davidson, my COO. He must be working with the Russians. If they've co-opted the sheriff, the whole town is compromised," Frank concluded grimly. "We need to move fast." Victor, who had been examining the covenant with scholarly attention, looked up. "There's something else here you should see." He pointed to a final clause in the document. "The covenant includes a mechanism for enforcement. If the agreement is violated, the Seneca have the right to reclaim all land covered by the covenant." Frank and Maggie exchanged alarmed glances. "All of it?" Frank asked. "The entire town?" "According to this, yes," Victor confirmed. "If mineral extraction occurred without Seneca consent, they could legally reclaim every acre of Bridgewood." The implications were staggering. Not just the mining rights, but homes, businesses. The entire town could theoretically revert to Seneca ownership if the covenant's terms had been violated. "Has any mining already taken place?" Frank asked Maggie. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Test extractions, small scale, but yes, technically we've already removed minerals from the site. Without Seneca consent," Frank added. "Without knowledge of the need for consent," she corrected. "But legally, the distinction may not matter." The weight of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just about who would profit from the rare earth elements. It was about the very existence of Bridgewood itself. "We need to get to Pittsburgh," Frank decided. "Now." Dave Miller's truck was a reliable 10-year-old Ford F-150, practical and anonymous enough to avoid immediate attention. Frank drove, with Maggie beside him and Victor in the back seat, the precious covenant secured in a waterproof document case Dave had provided. "We'll take back roads as much as possible," Frank explained as they left Bridgewood behind. "Longer, but less chance of running into roadblocks." Maggie nodded, her gaze fixed on the side mirror as if expecting pursuit at any moment. "My assistant will meet us in Pittsburgh with secure communications equipment. I need to contact my board. Explain the situation." "You think they'll back you?" Frank asked skeptically. "If Davidson is working against you, he might have already turned them." "Some, perhaps. Not all." She sounded more confident than she looked. "I built this company from nothing. There are still people there who remember that, who share my vision." Frank adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, considering his next words carefully. "And what is your vision exactly beyond the corporate mission statement?" Maggie was silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice had lost the practiced tone of a CEO addressing stakeholders. "My father lost everything when the auto plant closed. Not just his job, his identity, his purpose. I watched him fade away, become a shell of himself." She gazed out at the passing Pennsylvania countryside. "I swore I'd never let that happen to me, or to anyone else if I could help it." So Harrington Industries was born from that promise. Not immediately. First came engineering school, working 3 jobs to pay tuition, then a succession of positions in companies that talked about sustainability, but practice planned obsolescence. Her expression hardened at the memory. I started Harrington Green Energy in my garage with my life savings and a patent for improved solar cell efficiency. Frank recognized the familiar entrepreneurial story, not unlike his grandfather starting the auto shop with nothing but tools and determination. The Bridgewood project, Maggie continued, was supposed to be the culmination of everything I've worked for, not just mining rare earth elements, but creating a closed-loop system where they're extracted, refined, and manufactured into components all in one location. Jobs across the spectrum from traditional mining and manufacturing to high-tech engineering. And if the Seneca owned the mineral rights, then we partner with them. Fairly, transparently, she turned to face him directly. I'm not the villain in this story. Frank, I never wanted to demolish your garage or force anyone out. The original plan included adaptive reuse of historic structures like yours. From the back seat, Victor spoke up, his voice weaker than before. She's telling the truth, son. Robert would have supported this kind of project. Sustainable development with proper respect for the land and its people. Frank glanced at his father in the rearview mirror, concerned by the visible fatigue in his face. The momentary clarity was beginning to fade, the extraordinary effort of recalling and explaining the covenant taking its toll. We'll need to stop soon, Frank said. Dad needs rest, and frankly, so do you, he added to Maggie, noting the pallor beneath her composed exterior. She didn't argue, another sign of how the stress was affecting her health. An hour into their journey, Frank pulled into a small roadside motel, the kind of anonymous establishment that still took cash and asked few questions. He rented 2 rooms, using the ID and credit card Dave Miller had lent him rather than his own. We'll rest for a few hours, then continue, he decided. I'll take first watch. Victor was asleep almost as soon as he lay down, the extraordinary mental exertion having depleted his reserves. Frank sat in a chair by the window, keeping vigilant watch over both his father and the parking lot outside. In the adjacent room, Maggie was making similar preparations for rest when a soft knock came at the connecting door. She opened it to find Frank, his expression troubled. We need to talk about my father, he said without preamble. This level of clarity, it's not normal for late-stage Alzheimer's. Maggie invited him in with a gesture. You're concerned about what happens when it fades. When, not if, Frank confirmed grimly. I've seen this before. In the Navy hospital, patients rally, remember everything, seem almost cured, then crash harder than before. If that happens before we reach Pittsburgh, we have the covenant, Maggie pointed out, and we know Sarah Whitefeather's contact information. The covenant is only part of it. Dad has decades of context, relationships, history that isn't written down anywhere. Frank ran a hand through his hair in frustration. He's the link between the past and present, between Robert's work and ours. Maggie considered this, then reached for the burner phone. Let me try something. She dialed a number, had a brief conversation in hushed tones, then hung up with a satisfied expression. My assistant is sending someone to meet us here, a neurologist who specializes in Alzheimer's, someone I trust completely. Frank looked skeptical. You have a neurologist on standby. I have a heart condition that's killing me. Mr. Colton, medical specialists are very much within my network. She softened slightly. He can help keep your father stable long enough to reach Pittsburgh, maybe even help document his memories while he's lucid. Frank studied her, reevaluating yet again the complex woman before him. Thank you, he said finally. That's unexpectedly thoughtful. Contrary to what you might think, I don't actually enjoy destroying family legacies. A hint of genuine hurt colored her voice. I grew up watching my father lose everything he cared about. It's not something I'd wish on anyone. Before Frank could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He checked it, his expression darkening. It's Michael, he explained. Using a friend's phone, he says Davidson and the Russians have figured out where we're headed. They're sending people to intercept us. How would they know about Sarah Whitefeather? Maggie wondered aloud. They might not, specifically, but they know about the covenant now, and Pittsburgh is the logical destination for anyone seeking legal help with Native American land claims. Frank moved to the window, scanning the parking lot with renewed vigilance. We need to change our plans. They'll be watching the direct routes to Pittsburgh. Maggie joined him at the window. Your son. Do you trust his warning? Frank hesitated, the painful confrontation at the garage still fresh in his mind. Michael made choices I don't agree with, but he's still my son. If he's warning us, it's genuine. She nodded, accepting his assessment. Then we need a new strategy. We need a diversion, Frank decided. Something to throw them off our trail while we take an alternative route. Like what? Frank considered the problem from multiple angles, drawing on his military experience. We'll split up. I'll take the covenant documents and head north, then east through the back roads. You and my father continue toward Pittsburgh in Dave's truck, but don't go directly there. You want us to be the decoy? Maggie looked concerned. Your father isn't in any condition for that kind of stress. No, I want me to be the decoy, Frank corrected. They're primarily after the covenant. If they think I have it, they'll focus on me. While we take the actual covenant to Sarah Whitefeather, Maggie finished, understanding dawning. But won't they expect that it's the obvious play? Frank smiled grimly. Which is why we'll add another layer. I'll take convincing decoy documents. You'll carry what appears to be the real covenant, but is actually another decoy. The genuine article will be transported by someone else entirely. Someone they're not watching. Who? A soft knock interrupted them. Frank opened the door to find a distinguished-looking man in his 60s carrying a medical bag. Dr. Patel, Maggie greeted him with evident relief. Thank you for coming so quickly. Ms. Harrington, the doctor acknowledged with a slight bow. I came as soon as I received your message. He turned to Frank. And you must be Mr. Colton. I understand your father is experiencing a period of unusual clarity. As Frank showed Dr. Patel to Victor's room, a plan began forming in his mind. A risky plan, certainly, but one that might just work if they move quickly enough. Dr. Patel's examination of Victor was thorough and compassionate. When he finished, he spoke privately with Frank in the motel room's small bathroom, the running water providing cover for their conversation. Your father is experiencing what we call terminal lucidity, the doctor confirmed Frank's fears. It's not uncommon in Alzheimer's patients, particularly those with strong emotional connections to suppressed memories. How long will it last? Frank asked, dreading the answer. Impossible to predict precisely. Hours, perhaps a day or two at most. Dr. Patel's expression was gentle but honest. I can provide medication to help maintain his current state temporarily, but there will be a cost. The clearer he remains now, the more significant the decline will be afterward. Frank absorbed this information, the weight of it settling in his chest. But the medication would give us enough time to reach Pittsburgh to document what he knows. Yes, with careful management. Dr. Patel opened his medical bag, removing several vials and a small digital recorder. I brought equipment to document his recollections as well. Memory is my specialty, Mr. Colton, preserving it when possible, easing its loss when necessary. Frank nodded gratefully. There's something else I need to ask you, Doctor. Something that goes beyond your medical duties. Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow but listened attentively as Frank outlined his plan. When Frank finished, the doctor was silent for a long moment. What you're suggesting carries significant risk, he said finally. I know, but it might be our best chance. Dr. Patel considered, then nodded slowly. Ms. Harrington has been my patient for 3 years. In that time, I've come to respect her integrity greatly. If she believes this matter is as important as you say, then I will help. Frank extended his hand, which the doctor shook firmly. Thank you, Kinaman. When they emerged from the bathroom, Maggie was sitting beside Victor, engaged in conversation about her father's time in Vietnam. Victor was animated, his memories flowing with surprising detail. Your father had this old Leica camera, insisted it took better pictures than the military-issue ones. He was right, too. His photos captured something the others missed. Maggie smiled, genuinely moved by these previously unknown details about her father. I found his Vietnam photos after he died, never knew the stories behind them. Dr. Patel is going to help us document everything Dad remembers, Frank announced, and he's agreed to assist with our revised plan. He outlined the strategy. Dr. Patel would transport the actual covenant documents to Pittsburgh in his medical bag, a container unlikely to be searched given his professional status. Frank would travel alone with decoy documents, taking a visible route likely to attract attention. Maggie and Victor would take Dave's truck but head west initially before doubling back toward Pittsburgh through secondary roads. 3 targets, only one with the real prize, Frank concluded. They can't follow all of us. And when do we execute this plan? Maggie asked. Immediately. Davidson and his Russian friends have resources we don't. Every hour gives them more time to mobilize. Dr. Patel raised a practical concern. Ms. Harrington's condition requires regular medication and monitoring. The stress of this situation is already taxing her heart significantly. Frank glanced at Maggie, who looked uncomfortable with this clinical assessment of her vulnerability. All the more reason to move quickly, she insisted. The sooner we reach Sarah Whitefeather, the sooner this is resolved. I've arranged transportation, Dr. Patel informed them. A medical transport vehicle is waiting behind the motel. It's equipped with emergency supplies and communications equipment. Putnam, Frank was impressed. You manage that without alerting anyone. I have a private practice with discreet resources, Mr. and Colton, and I've been Ms. Harrington's doctor long enough to understand when situations require unusual measures. The plan came together with military precision. Frank carefully created decoy documents, using materials from the motel's business center. The genuine covenant was secured in a specialized document preservation sleeve and hidden within Dr. Patel's medical equipment. Victor's memories were being systematically recorded, his voice stronger and more assured than it had been in years. As they prepared to separate, Frank took a moment alone with his father. Dad, I need you to go with Maggie and do exactly what she says. It's important. Victor studied his son's face with surprising clarity. You're playing the sacrifice play, drawing their fire. Frank smiled slightly. Just like you taught me in chess. I also taught you not to be reckless. Victor gripped his son's arm with unexpected strength. These aren't amateur criminals. Frank, the men who killed Robert were professionals. I'll be careful, Frank promised. But this is bigger than us now. If what you've told us about the covenant is true, it could change everything not just for Bridgewood, but for similar communities across the country. Victor nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud of you. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a battered compass that had been Robert's. Take this. It brought him home from a lot of bad situations, not the last one, but many before that. Frank accepted the compass, recognizing it from the photographs of his uncle. I'll see you in Pittsburgh. Count on it. Victor embraced his son fiercely. The Colton men are hard to kill. Moments later, they executed their plan. Frank departed first in a taxi Dr. Patel had called, heading conspicuously toward the main highway with his decoy documents. Maggie and Victor left 30 minutes later in Dave's truck, taking a westward route. Dr. Patel waited a full hour before departing in his medical transport vehicle, the genuine covenant hidden among equipment and supplies. As Frank's taxi merged onto the highway, he spotted them almost immediately, a black SUV pulling out from a side road, maintaining a discreet but unmistakable distance behind him. The bait had been taken. He directed the taxi driver to a bus station, paid in cash, and made a show of purchasing a ticket to Pittsburgh. Then, in a prearranged maneuver, He slipped out through a service entrance where another taxi was waiting. The game of cat and mouse had begun. Frank had no illusions about the danger he was facing, but he'd survived war zones and submarine emergencies. He could handle corporate thugs and Russian mercenaries at least long enough to ensure the Covenant reached Sarah Whitefeather safely. What he hadn't counted on was Michael calling again. "Dad, they know about the split." His son's voice was urgent, frightened. "Davidson has people tracking all of you. They've identified Dr. Patel and know he's carrying something important." Frank's blood ran cold. "How did they find out?" "I don't know, but they're converging on his location now. And Dad, they're not just trying to get the documents anymore. Davidson is talking about permanent solutions. They're going to kill him," Frank translated grimly. "And Maggie and Dad too, if they get the chance." "I think so. Yes. Dad, I'm sorry. I never thought—" "Where are you now?" Frank interrupted. "Bridgewood, at the garage. Stay there. Don't trust anyone, especially not the sheriff." Frank's mind raced through options, discarding one after another. "I need you to do something for me. In the garage office, behind the filing cabinet, there's a hidden safe. Combination is your birthday. Inside is a satellite phone, military grade, untraceable. Use it to call this number." He rattled off a series of digits, a contact from his Navy days he'd hoped never to need again. "Tell them Winter Harbor Protocol. They'll understand." "Dad, what is this? Who am I calling old friends?" Frank replied tersely. "People who can help level the playing field." After ending the call, Frank directed his new taxi to change course. Dr. Patel was in immediate danger, and Frank had inadvertently placed him there. He couldn't live with another death on his conscience. The taxi driver, sensing the urgency, pushed the speed limit as Frank tracked Dr. Patel's location through a secure messaging app they'd established earlier. The doctor was on a secondary road, still 30 minutes from Pittsburgh, vulnerable and exposed. Frank had the taxi drop him at a used car dealership just off the highway. Cash, a convincing story about an emergency, and the dealer's recognition of a fellow veteran resulted in Frank driving away in a 15-year-old Jeep Cherokee 10 minutes later. Not ideal, but faster than waiting for another taxi, and considerably more maneuverable if it came to evasive driving. He called Dr. Patel's secure line. "Doctor, you've been compromised. Pull over somewhere public. Lots of witnesses." "I was beginning to suspect as much," the doctor replied calmly. "There's a vehicle that has been behind me for the past 20 minutes, maintaining exactly the same distance. Can you reach a police station?" "I believe so. There should be one in the next town, approximately 5 miles ahead." "Go there. Now. Don't stop for anything else." Frank pushed the Jeep hard, following the GPS coordinates for Dr. Patel's location. He was still 10 minutes away when the doctor called back. "Mr. Colton, they're making a move. A second vehicle has appeared ahead, slowing down. They appear to be attempting to box me in. Can you see the police station yet?" "Not yet. We're in a rather isolated stretch of road." Frank swore under his breath. "Doctor, I need you to do exactly as I say. When I tell you, slam on your brakes as hard as you can, then accelerate immediately and ram the vehicle in front of you." "Mr. Colton, I'm a doctor, not a stunt driver," Patel protested. "Right now you're a target," Frank countered. "And that medical transport has a reinforced front end for accident scenarios. Trust me." He could hear the doctor's heavy breathing as he contemplated this drastic action. "Very well. When—" "Not yet. Keep driving normally." "I'm almost there." Frank pushed the Jeep to its limits, the aging engine protesting as he navigated the winding country road. Finally, he spotted them ahead, the medical transport sandwiched between two black SUVs, being steadily forced toward the shoulder. "Now, Doctor, brakes. Then ram." Through the phone, he heard the squeal of brakes, then the distinctive crunch of metal on metal. Frank accelerated, bringing the Jeep alongside the rear SUV and swerving hard into its side. The impact was jarring, deploying the Jeep's airbag and sending the SUV skidding across the road. Dazed but functional, Frank forced his door open and staggered out. Ahead, Dr. Patel had successfully executed the maneuver. The medical transport now passed the front SUV, accelerating away. The rear SUV's door opened, and a familiar figure emerged the Russian from the previous night. Now sporting a split lip and a murderous expression, he reached inside his jacket, but Frank was already moving, drawing on combat training that had become muscle memory through years of practice. The fight was brief but vicious. The Russian was professionally trained, but Frank had the advantage of righteous anger and the knowledge that lives depended on his success. A series of calculated strikes left the Russian unconscious on the asphalt. Frank retrieved the man's weapon, a compact Makarov pistol, and turned his attention to the second SUV. It had recovered from the initial confusion and was beginning to pursue Dr. Patel again. The Jeep was damaged but still drivable. Frank jumped back in, ignoring the deployed airbag and the pain radiating from what was almost certainly a cracked rib. He pursued the second SUV, the Makarov on the seat beside him, a last resort he hoped not to need. Up ahead, the medical transport had gained ground, but not enough. The SUV was closing again, its superior engine power giving it an advantage on the straightaway. Frank keyed the satellite phone he'd taken from the Russian. "Doctor, there's a turn coming up in about half a mile. Take it hard, then pull over immediately after. I'll handle the rest." "Mr. Colton, are you sure? Just do it." He watched as the medical transport took the sharp turn at speed, tires squealing in protest. The SUV followed, equally fast but with better handling. Frank took the turn even faster, using the Jeep's off-road capabilities to cut across the inside corner. As instructed, Dr. Patel had pulled over just beyond the turn. The SUV slowed, its occupants momentarily confused by this apparent surrender. It was all the opening Frank needed. He brought the Jeep alongside the SUV and executed a perfect precision immobilization technique, a maneuver he'd learned in Navy security training. The Jeep's front end struck the SUV's rear quarter panel at precisely the right angle, sending it into an uncontrollable spin that ended with the vehicle in a roadside ditch. Frank pulled up behind the medical transport, where Dr. Patel was waiting with remarkable composure given the circumstances. "Are you hurt?" Frank asked, scanning the doctor for injuries. "Nothing serious. You, however, appear to have at least one broken rib and potential airbag burns." "Occupational hazard." Frank dismissed the injuries. "The covenant, secure," Dr. Patel confirmed. "Though I must say, Mr. Colton, your rescue methods are rather more dramatic than I anticipated." Frank managed a pained smile. "Navy training. We're thorough." He checked the disabled SUV, confirming its occupants were alive but incapacitated. "We need to move quickly. There will be others. Ms. Harrington and your father. I'll contact them once we're mobile again. The Jeep's done for, so we'll take your vehicle." As they transferred to the medical transport, Frank's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but alarming. "Davidson has Maggie and Victor. Abandoned factory outside Greensburg. Come alone or they die. M." Frank showed the message to Dr. Patel. "Michael's been compromised, or is attempting to warn you of a trap," the doctor suggested. "Either way, Maggie and my father are in danger." Frank's expression hardened with resolve. "New plan. You continue to Pittsburgh with the Covenant. I'm going to Greensburg. Alone against what are likely multiple armed adversaries." Dr. Patel looked skeptical. "That seems ill-advised, medically speaking. I made a call earlier. Help should be arriving soon." Frank checked the Russian's pistol, ensuring it was loaded and functional. "Besides, I have more experience with this sort of thing than you might think." Dr. Patel studied him for a moment, then reached into his medical bag. "At least allow me to tape those ribs and provide proper pain management before you embark on your rescue mission." Frank submitted to the doctor's ministrations, using the time to formulate a strategy. The abandoned factory would be Davidson's chosen ground, which meant Frank needed to change the terms of engagement, create his own advantages. There, Dr. Patel said finally, securing the last of the medical tape. Not ideal, but better than nothing. The medication I've given you will manage the pain without clouding your judgment. Frank nodded gratefully. Thank you, doctor, for everything. Just bring them back safely. Dr. Patel replied. All of them. They parted ways at a rural crossroads, the doctor continuing toward Pittsburgh with the precious covenant, while Frank headed for Greensburg in the borrowed SUV from the disabled Russians. The satellite phone buzzed as he drove his Navy contact acknowledging the Winter Harbor Protocol and confirming that assets were being mobilized. Frank allowed himself a grim smile. Davidson and his Russian partners had no idea what was coming their way. But first, Frank needed to reach Maggie and his father, assess the situation, and if possible, extract them before the real fireworks began. The abandoned factory loomed on the outskirts of Greensburg, a relic of Pennsylvania's industrial past, now reduced to a hulking shell of rust and broken windows. Frank approached cautiously, parking the SUV a quarter-mile away and proceeding on foot. Years of military training took over as he conducted a reconnaissance of the perimeter. 2 guards at the main entrance, another patrolling the fence line, and undoubtedly more inside. Professional security, not local muscle like Pete Kellerman and his friends. Frank circled to the rear of the complex, identifying a partially collapsed section of wall that offered access with minimal exposure. As he prepared to move, his phone vibrated with another text. 30 minutes and counting. Davidson losing patience. He needed to hurry, but he also needed information. Using the Russian satellite phone, he placed a call to a number he'd memorized earlier. Michael, it's Dad. A moment of startled silence. How did you get this number? Not important. Are you still at the garage? Yes, but Dad, they're going to kill them. Davidson said, I know what he said. I need you to focus. Did you make the call I asked you to? Yes, some woman answered. Said, assets deploying, whatever that means. It means help is coming. Now I need you to do one more thing for me. Pull up the factory schematics. What factory? The abandoned steel pressing plant outside Greensburg. County records should have the original building plans. I need to know the layout, especially utility access points. Michael sounded confused but complied, the sounds of keyboard clicking coming through the phone. Dad, who are these people you called? What's going on? Let's just say I didn't spend all 10 years in the Navy turning wrenches, Frank replied. Those schematics. While Michael searched for the information, Frank continued his reconnaissance, identifying potential entry and exit points, noting guard positions and rotations. By the time Michael called back with the schematics, Frank had formulated his approach. There's a maintenance tunnel that runs under the main floor, Michael explained. Connects to an external access point about 50 yards from the southeast corner of the building. Perfect. Anything else I should know? Dad. Michael hesitated. I'm sorry. About everything. I never thought Davidson would go this far. I just wanted you to have a comfortable retirement, not worry about the garage anymore. We'll talk about it later, Frank replied, his voice softening slightly. Right now, I need to focus on getting your grandfather and Miss Harrington out safely. Be careful. Always am. Frank ended the call, checked his makeshift equipment one last time, and began his approach. The maintenance tunnel was exactly where Michael had indicated, its entrance partially concealed by years of vegetation growth. Frank slipped inside, navigating by the light of his phone through the dank, narrow passage. Above him, he could hear voices echoing through the cavernous factory space, Davidson's cultured tones contrasting with the heavier accents of his Russian partners. Frank couldn't make out the words, but the tension in the voices was unmistakable. Time was running out. The tunnel emerged into a small mechanical room filled with rusting equipment. Frank eased the door open, finding himself in a shadowed corner of the main factory floor. From his position, he could see Maggie and Victor seated back-to-back in metal chairs. bound but apparently unharmed. Davidson paced before them, checking his watch periodically. 3 Russians stood nearby, weapons visible. The situation was exactly as bad as Frank had feared. He needed a distraction, something to draw attention away from the hostages long enough for him to make a move. As if in answer to his thoughts, his satellite phone vibrated with a text. "Assets in position, awaiting your signal." Frank smiled grimly. Right on time. He texted back a single word, "Execute." The effect was immediate and dramatic. The factory's few remaining exterior lights went dark as power to the building was cut. Simultaneously, a deafening explosion rocked the far side of the complex, not large enough to cause structural damage, but more than sufficient to create chaos and confusion. In the momentary darkness and disorientation, Frank moved. He crossed to Maggie and Victor in seconds, a knife already working on their restraints. "Frank," Maggie's voice was a relieved whisper. "Stay low, move fast, don't stop for anything," he instructed, freeing her hands. "Head for the south exit. There's a team waiting to extract you." "Team what team?" But she was already helping Victor to his feet, supporting the older man as Frank finished cutting his bonds. "Friends," Frank replied simply. "Go now." As they moved toward the exit, taking advantage of the continuing confusion, Davidson's voice cut through the darkness. "Stop them! They're getting away." Gunfire erupted, bullets striking machinery and walls around them. Frank pushed Maggie and Victor behind a massive press for cover, drawing the Russian's pistol. "Keep going," he ordered. "I'll cover you." Victor gripped his son's arm. "Not without you." "I'll be right behind you," Frank promised. "But you need to move now." More explosions rocked the building as Frank's assets continued their assault on the perimeter. Through the chaos, he could hear professional voices coordinating in military cadence. His Navy contacts had sent serious help. Maggie hesitated, her expression conflicted. "Frank, go," he insisted. "The Covenant is more important than any of us. Make sure it reaches Sarah Whitefeather." She nodded once, decisive, then helped Victor toward the exit, staying low and using the machinery for cover. Frank provided covering fire, forcing Davidson and the Russians to keep their heads down. As Maggie and Victor reached the door, Frank prepared to follow, but a bullet caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him back against the support column. The pain was immediate and intense. Despite Dr. Patel's medication, through the haze of shock and adrenaline, Frank saw Davidson approaching, weapon raised for a killing shot, but before he could fire, another figure tackled him from behind Michael, somehow having found his way into the factory. Father and son locked eyes across the chaotic space. No words were necessary. Frank nodded once, acknowledging what Michael had risked by coming here, then forced himself to his feet and staggered toward the exit. Outside, a tactical team in unmarked gear was securing the perimeter. One of them spotted Frank and moved to assist him. "Colton, I'm Lieutenant Reeves. Commander Watkins sends his regards." "My father and Ms. Harrington?" Frank asked, allowing himself to be supported. "Already in the medical evac, sir. Your son, still inside, with Davidson." Reeves nodded, gesturing to 2 of his team. "Alvarez, Martinez, with me. We're retrieving 1 more." As Frank was helped toward a waiting helicopter, he looked back at the factory. The tactical team was entering with practiced efficiency, weapons ready but disciplined. His son would be safe in their hands. Maggie and Victor were already aboard the helicopter, a medic attending to them. Victor looked exhausted but conscious, his brief clarity beginning to fade but still holding. Maggie immediately moved to make room for Frank, her expression a mixture of relief and concern as she saw his wounded shoulder. "You're hit," she said unnecessarily. "Just a scratch." He lied, the pain suggesting something considerably more serious. "Michael," Victor asked, his voice weak but determined. "They're bringing him out now," Frank assured his father. "He'll be okay." As the medic began treating his wound, Frank watched through the helicopter's open door as the tactical team emerged from the factory with Michael between them, disheveled, but apparently unharmed. Behind them, Davidson and the Russians were being led out in restraints. The satellite phone buzzed one final time. Frank checked the message. Package secured. White Feather briefed. Covenant authenticated. It was over. They had won. As the helicopter lifted off, Frank felt the adrenaline finally wearing off, the full weight of his injuries making themselves known. But the pain was secondary to the profound relief of seeing his father and son safe, of knowing the Covenant had reached its destination. Beside him, Maggie took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her condition. "Thank you," she said simply. Frank nodded, too exhausted for words. The helicopter banked toward Pittsburgh, carrying them toward a future suddenly filled with new possibilities and second chances for them all. 3 months later, Frank stood in the renovated garage, watching as his father explained the finer points of a transmission rebuild to a class of attentive students. Victor's Alzheimer's had progressed significantly after his remarkable period of clarity, but he still had good days where he could share a lifetime of mechanical wisdom. The Bridgewood Seneca Technical Institute now occupied an expanded garage space, a joint venture between Harrington Industries and the Seneca Nation. Under the terms of the newly honored covenant, the rare earth mining operation proceeded with Seneca oversight and fair compensation, while the Technical Institute trained local residents for both traditional mechanical skills and new green technology applications. "He seems happy," Maggie observed, joining Frank at the observation window. Her color was better than it had been 3 months ago, though she still moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing a serious condition. "Happiest I've seen him in years," Frank agreed. "Having purpose makes a difference." The legal fallout from the Covenant's discovery had been complex but ultimately productive. Sarah Whitefeather had represented the Seneca Nation brilliantly, negotiating a settlement that acknowledged historical wrongs while creating a framework for mutual benefit moving forward. Davidson and his Russian partners faced federal charges for conspiracy, attempted murder, and various other crimes. Michael had provided key testimony against them, earning himself immunity and, more importantly to him, a chance to rebuild his relationship with his father. "Any word on the transplant list?" Frank asked, nodding toward the medical alert bracelet on Maggie's wrist. "Still waiting," she replied with forced casualness. "But Dr. Patel is optimistic about the new treatment protocol." Frank nodded, not pressing further. They had developed an unspoken agreement not to dwell on the fragility of their situations, his shoulder that would never regain full function, her heart that could fail without warning. Instead, they focused on what they could build together with whatever time they had left. The Technical Institute was just the beginning. Plans were already underway for a comprehensive community revitalization project that honored Bridgewood's industrial past while creating a sustainable future. "Sarah called this morning," Maggie mentioned. "The historical preservation documentation is complete. Your father's memories, combined with the covenant and other records, have created a comprehensive account of what happened in 1924. "Good," Frank said simply. "Some truth shouldn't stay buried." Through the window, they watched as Victor guided a young woman, a former steelworker's daughter, through the intricate process of diagnosing an electrical system fault. His hands, though less steady than they once were, still moved with the confidence of decades of experience. "Second chances," Maggie murmured, almost to herself. "For all of us." Frank nodded, understanding completely. For his father, a chance to pass on his knowledge before memory failed entirely. For Michael, an opportunity to redirect his talents towards something meaningful. For Bridgewood, a path forward that honored its past while embracing a new future. And for Frank and Maggie themselves, two wounded souls who had found in each other an unexpected alliance that was evolving into something neither had been looking for, but both increasingly valued. "Second chances," Frank agreed, his hand finding hers. "Worth fighting for." Outside the Institute, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Bridgewood in a clean white blanket that hid the scars of its industrial past while preserving the strength beneath. A fitting metaphor, Frank thought, for what they were all experiencing, not an erasure of what had come before, but a fresh beginning built on foundations that had proven their durability through the hardest of times. There would be challenges ahead. Victor's condition would worsen. Maggie's health remained precarious. The balance between tradition and progress would require constant attention and adjustment. But for now, in this moment, watching his father teach and feeling Maggie's hand in his, Frank Colton was exactly where he needed to be, not fighting the future, but helping to shape it, not losing his past, but honoring it by building something new. A second chance, indeed. 3 months of winter snow had come and gone, covering the scars of battle but not erasing them. In the expanded garage where 3 generations of mechanics had kept a town moving forward, new voices now mingled with old wisdom. Some dreams survive even when memory fades. They had fought for different visions of the future. The mechanic with grease-stained hands, the CEO with a failing heart, the father slipping between clarity and shadows, the son who almost chose the wrong side of history. Each had lost something in the struggle-perfect health. Corporate empires, unfettered memories, untarnished reputations. Yet in their losses, they had discovered something more valuable than rare earth minerals or real estate deeds. The truth had cost them dearly. It always does. But truth, like the covenant hidden in an old toolbox for nearly a century, finds its way to the surface eventually. Some battles aren't about winning or losing, but about who you become in the fighting and who stands beside you when the smoke clears. As the first students graduated from the Bridgewood Seneca Technical Institute, 2 unlikely allies watched from the back row, their hands quietly finding each other's. Perhaps that's the most valuable second chance of all, discovering that the road ahead, however uncertain, no longer has to be traveled alone.